First of all, welcome to the first Animal Matters talk of spring semester. It is my honor, privilege, and absolute joy to introduce our speaker today, Emma Marris. Emma is the author of two books, one of which, Wild Souls, she will be talking about today, but which we have used for our wildlife book club for the master's program for 2 years running. It has provoked lots of discussion, and so we are thrilled to have you here today. Emma has also written the book Rambunctious Garden, looking at the meaning of nature, and has published in the New York Times and National Geographic and all kinds of places. In fact, I think I first encountered your writing in your article in the New York Times about zoos, which I have also used for the Wildlife in Captivity class, so, and which I know is part of Wild Souls as well. Anyway, I'm done here, and I'm so thrilled that you're here. Thank you for coming, Emma.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks all for coming. I really appreciate it. I really enjoy seeing the Valentine's-themed outfits, but I did not intend to wear all black on Valentine's Day, but if you want to take it as my comment on state of romance, you can. So I'm going to talk today about Wild Souls, but I wanted to sort of start out by giving you a sense of where I'm coming from. So I'm basically a journalist, and I've been writing about mostly ecology and conservation since about 2005. I started out on staff at the scientific journal Nature in the reporting department, writing news about science. And that's where I got really interested in ecology and conservation and questions like, what is the meaning of nature? So, what is this? And I use this slide in particular because this is the Grand Canyon of the Yellowstone, one of the places that has been sort of enshrined as nature with a capital N in this country. But one thing that I noticed when I was there in person is that it's one of the least biodiverse parks we've got. There's like 4 or 5 species of tree and, more species of charismatic megafauna than many other parks, but ecologically and actually not as complicated as, the Everglades, say. So reporting in conservation and ecology, one thing that I think that I had as an advantage is that I wasn't formally academically trained in those disciplines, so I was coming to it as a kind of an outsider. I was an English major. And so when I first started reporting on conservation, I hadn't been taught the sort of values of conservation that you're brought up with if you go through school to be a conservationist. And a lot of those values actually come out of one single paper, which is this 1985 paper by Michael Soule, who more or less founded the discipline of conservation biology. And so the values that are baked into the field, more or less, are that biodiversity is good and extinction is bad, and we have almost nothing to say about individual animals. And this is a direct quote from the paper that, the disease and suffering is unpleasant and perhaps regrettable, but that's about it. It's just not the domain of conservation to worry about it. It's all about populations. I was interested in the role of values in conservation, and that's what I started working on my first book about. I had this kind of short list of things that might be valuable in the non-human world, but there's problems with all of them. If you say, we want to have more species rather than less species, well, then what species concept are you using? Or if we want to talk about native species being something that we want to promote, there's a lot of interesting, chewy philosophical questions about what counts as native and what year is your cutoff, and should we still be trying to preserve native species and native habitats if the climate is changing and they're moving in response to that? So I found all these questions super duper interesting, and that's what I wrote my first book about, Rambunctious Garden. And the sort of take home, this sort of too long didn't read, is there's no part of nature that is completely uninfluenced by humans. So categorizing nature by measuring how much humans have influenced it is sort of the wrong way to look at things. The whole human-nature duality that all of conservation is basically built on doesn't really make any sense scientifically. It's just a cultural thing. And so all of these things that derive from the value of naturalness, like wildness and wilderness, are themselves also kind of problematic. One great example of this is the way in which certain ecosystem states are considered better, because that's the way it looked like when Europeans first showed up. But increasingly, we're learning that those ecosystem states weren't human-free states, they were just white people-free states. These were land management outcomes that came out of many, many thousands of years of indigenous management. And this has kind of been a real puzzle for conservationists to sort of figure out, well, are we then supposed to have a new baseline that's further back in time, or are we supposed to somehow say that, well, we just don't like the way white people manage landscapes and we want to go back to this earlier management scheme? So it's been kind of a complicated question. So I kind of crossed out these last two values, at least for myself. Nativeness and naturalness, I don't think help us. They don't steer us in the right direction when we're trying to figure out what our goals should be or where to put our resources. So that left me with these other three items. And then in 2013, I moved to Klamath Falls, Oregon. And I'd been living in the Midwest because of my husband's academic career. And we moved to kind of a rural part of Oregon, and I went looking around for stories to cover as a journalist. And at that time, wolves had just kind of been reintroduced in Oregon, and it was a hot topic. So I thought, okay, here's a nice, chewy story to write about. And the way I decided to write about it is when I was learning about, at this time, there were only like a dozen wolves in Oregon, maybe a few more. And many of them had radio collars on. And one of them in particular had been radio collared, I think at that time, like 3 or 4 different separate times, because this particular animal was really tough on collars, really athletic, really mobile, kept knocking them off, kept deactivating them. But he was also the dad, you know, we used to say the alpha male, but that has a lot of connotations that I think are incorrect. So he was the dad of the first wolf pack in Oregon, and so it was important to researchers to keep tabs on him. So they just kept knocking him out with tranquilizer darts and putting more collars on him. And so he had this huge paper trail, and I thought it would be really interesting to write a magazine piece that was like a biography of just this one individual animal. Originally my thought was to use this as a way to talk about wolf reintroduction. But I reported the heck out of it, and I got to know this animal pretty well. And I interviewed the biologists who'd done all these collarings, and I hung out in his home territory, and I went to his den site and all this stuff. And then I found out one day, I got a phone call from a friend of mine that said, "Oh, did you hear? He's been shot." And my heart dropped in this way that was very much like if you'd heard something horrible had happened to a friend of yours. And I had the real realization in that moment that I cared about this animal as an individual, not just as a journalistic topic or not just as a way to manage or monitor populations. And so this kind of blew my brain open, and I started to think about all the stuff we put these wolves through when we're doing these reintroduction programs, and all the times that we chase them down and collar them and take them away from their territories that they chose and put them in boxes and move them to other places. And then we ask them to live in these really complicated landscapes that are filled with livestock and like angry people with guns, and we're like, good luck, I hope you don't break too many rules, because if you do, we'll kill you. And I started thinking it was kind of a bad deal for the individual wolves that were involved in these projects, even if potentially the reintroduction goals were a good deal sort of from a conservation perspective. So that's when I embarked on this idea of trying to figure out how to fit individuals into my understanding of what is good or what is valuable philosophically about the natural world. And that's what led to this more recent book, Wild Souls, is my quest to try to reconcile sort of animal ethics with conservation ethics. And it's really knotty and twisty, and like, honestly, I find it really interesting, and my favorite thing to write about is conflicts within the good guys, you know? When you're an environmental journalist, it's pretty typical to write about good guys versus bad guys, like developers and fossil fuel companies and corrupt politicians and what have you. And that's important work, but I find it really interesting when people who are good disagree vehemently with each other, because that's where you get like the really chewy stuff. These are the kids of OR4, which is the individual that I featured in my story. And when I was beginning to think about how individuals might fit into all of this, one thought I had was that the wildness that I had basically crossed out in my previous work might still be in play as something that doesn't pertain to landscapes or to ecosystems necessarily, but to individuals. And obviously that's not new news that there are wild animals, but thinking about what does that mean, and are these heavily managed wolves really that wild if they are all tracked and we know where they are and we have rules for them, and if they step out of line, we move them physically or we kill them? That made them seem like they were potentially less wild than, for example, a rat or a pigeon in the city that has no name and no tracking number, and we don't know anything about it, and we can't control it, and we can't even kill it if we try. We have tried. Many people have tried. I've written whole articles about people trying to kill rats. So in some ways, they seem wilder, right, by some definitions. So I kind of came up with this working idea that wildness is really about the sort of decision-making abilities of an individual animal. It's not about whether that animal ever bred with a domestic animal in its lineage, or whether that animal was necessarily even moved to its location by people, but it's more about whether they, on a sort of day-to-day basis, have freedom of action. So like the kind of jokey way I talk about this is the breakfast test. Like if you are deciding what to have for breakfast, then you are wild. But if somebody else is like, here's your breakfast, you are not wild. And I sort of thought this was something that I think would be important to add into what is good in nature. The way you could kind of add this in is under the category of flourishing, which is this nice philosophical and kind of pretty term, which is sort of like happiness, but it's a little bit more respectable and mature than happiness. Like, if you just are like playing Mario Kart and eating ice cream, you're happy. But if you are like fulfilling your destiny as a veterinarian or as a animal policy expert, and you are making good change in the world and creating excellent relationships with those around you and being, that's flourishing. Of course, you do need some Mario Kart and ice cream to flourish. Like, that's part of the package, but it can't be all Mario Kart and ice cream. So I wanted to learn more about these animal ethics and how this all fit in. So I had to start at the beginning because I didn't know anything about this stuff. I was an ecology reporter, and so I went back to the main guys. That if you kind of like look at the Wikipedia for animal ethics, this is what you get. So we've got our utilitarian approaches, exemplified by Peter Singer. The idea that you've got something like interests or happiness or preferences, some kind of measurement of what the animal wants or what's good for the animal or the people, and you try to maximize this all around. You try to create a world where if you sort of add up all of the preference, satisfaction, or happiness of all the individuals, it's better. It rises over time. That's good. And in the 70s, he kind of expanded this idea to animals. But he didn't actually have a lot to say about wild animals in that famous book. Like, he basically said that as long as we don't mess with them, that's all we need to do. Just like stay out of their way. Don't play God. And then the sort of classical opposing view is the animal rights approach, exemplified by Tom Reagan, which is more like, I think of it as animal Kantianism. It's the idea that you can't, they have like an inalienable existence and right, and you can't just use them as tools. You can't just treat them like things, subjects of a life. But interestingly, he has a very similar final take-home on wild animals, which is basically just like leave them alone. But also, interestingly, that the rare ones are not more important or valuable than the common ones, which is something that conservationists just have like in their heads. If you're the last Amazonian dolphin, you are way more valuable than if you are, I don't know, like a sea lion in Seattle that's eating all the salmon that is going to get shot. So I started wading into some of the questions that I had about wildlife, armed with these initial ideas. And the first one I started thinking about is the idea of assisting wild animals. Okay, so if these classical animal ethics guys basically said that we shouldn't do anything with wild animals, that the ethical thing to do is just leave them alone, then what do we do when what we're doing in a broader sense is messing with their lives? So the sort of classic hypothetical on this is the polar bear. We are increasing the temperature through climate change. So now they're not able to hunt on the sea ice because there is no sea ice. And so now they are in some places. And in the book, there's a lot of caveats to the actual data on this. But let's go with the hypothetical. You've got a polar bear. It's starving because it can't hunt on the sea ice because of climate change. Now, is this something that we say, well, that sucks, but it's a wild animal, so we just leave it alone? Or does the fact that we've now kind of intervened in its life through climate change our obligations? And so I found, this formatting issue with this slide. Anyway, I found Claire Palmer as a philosopher really helpful on this. She's written, in fact, directly about that particular hypothetical. And she calls the idea, the received view, that you don't have any ethical obligations to wild animals, the laissez-faire intuition. And I think a lot of us grew up with this, right? Like, sometimes if somebody tried to help a sick wild animal, we'd be like, no, you've got to let nature take its course. Like, I think a lot of us grew up with that idea. But that sort of assumes that they're in their world and we're in our world, and there are no interactions or causal links between them, which is just madness. I mean, they're all living in our world. That's just the world. They call it the Anthropocene for a reason. It's hotter. It's completely broken up. All the habitat is fragmented. There's roads everywhere. Like a third of it is agriculture. Every animal on the planet is coping at some level with what we've done. So, it seems to me that actually we do have some obligations to those polar bears. Although the specifics of how we would potentially discharge them, I think, are a lot more complicated than just saying, actually, we can't just let them die. A lot of the book is concerned with these case studies where conservation ethics go right up against animal ethics. I'm just using animal ethics to cover both the rights approaches and the utilitarian approaches. And so I'm going to talk about a couple of them. We'll kind of go through them quickly so we'll have room for questions. I know you guys many of you have another class after this, so we gotta be on a tight schedule. So let's talk about zoos. I actually went in. My real interest was in the conservation stuff, but I thought, well, many readers aren't going to be personally involved in island eradications of introduced predators, but they will probably have personal experience with the zoo. So let's start there and see what we think about that. And I went into it with a pretty open mind, honestly. The current argument of zoos in general is that they are conservation institutions. You cannot even be accredited at the AZA unless you have a conservation mission as part of your mission statement. So the argument is that they have a kind of a two-pronged argument. One is that spending time at the zoo, learning about the animals, and interacting with these ambassadors in captivity will make people more supportive of conservation and nature more broadly. And then the other prong is that zoos themselves are involved in some level of captive breeding, conservation, and they also give money to conservation organizations that work in the field. Okay, fine. So I investigated that, and I also investigated how zoo animals, how happy are they? Do they like their life? Okay, so we start with the basic premise here that flourishing of sentient creatures is a valuable thing, right? We're going way back here. And then the evidence seemed really clear just by reading the papers that there are a big group of animals that don't like being in captivity. Like, it's just, they have a lot of repetitive behaviors, they have a lot of mental health problems. Many of them in zoos are actually given like mental health drugs like antipsychotics or SSRIs. And also I found this amazingly fascinating book that I cite at great length about animal escapes from zoos and the huge long history of them, and how a lot of them have been suppressed intentionally by zoos because it kind of shows that smart animals don't want to be there. I was so kind of obsessed with that book, honestly. So the value of their captivity has to be pretty high, I think, to sort of justify all of that well-documented unhappiness. And that's where I was really actually surprised by how bad the evidence was, that there was a lot of value coming out of the zoos. I I called up the people who work on this and I said, give me your best papers. I called up the head of the AZA and I said, give me the data, give me your best work. And I wasn't super impressed. We were seeing very small effect sizes. We were seeing lots of evidence to show that most people go to zoos to like have a good day out with their family. And that's a function that's a role it plays for most of the visitors, not as a conservation education experience. So I concluded that I don't think it's worth it. I just don't think that the captivity, and let's caveat this. There are animals that I think that we don't have a lot of evidence showing that they hate being in zoos. In general, my feeling is that it is larger animals, more cognitively complex animals, more social animals, and animals with big territories or migratory or dispersal patterns that don't like being in zoos. But guess what? Those are the best animals. Those are the animals in the like animal zoo cracker box. That's the elephants, that's the lions, that's the tigers, that's the bears. That's all the greatest hits. You take those guys out and you're left with like some sleepy reptiles, some ground squirrels, I will be psyched to go see some ground squirrels and some sleepy reptiles. And I'm sure many of you would be psyched to go to a zoo that was hosting populations of animals that were like, finally a reprieve from the endless predation of me and my fastly reproducing kin on our tiny territories. Like, we love it here. But those aren't the ones that are getting people indoors. The data is it's elephants above everything, and then it's the sort of second tier. And of course, elephants are the ones who are the most unhappy and the ones that like die in their midlife. Okay, so zoos, not a fan. Let's move on to captive breeding. Captive breeding is an interesting one. So now we're in the conservation world. I used condors as my case study here because it's the classic example of a case where all of the wild members of the population of the species were taken into captivity, and then they were bred, and then they were reintroduced into the wild. And some people put that in quotes because they are still very much being helped in a large, on a daily basis. One thing that you may not know about the California condor captive breeding program is that there were people who hated the idea at the time and were very much against it, and they were environmentalists. They felt that it would abrogate the wildness of the California condor to take it in. That basically, most of them didn't go quite this far. Many of them argued that they would be fine on their own, that they did not need to be taken in. But some of them actually did argue that it would be preferable to see them go extinct than to see them be captives. So there was a real sort of interesting value collision there, and I thought that was really interesting. When I interviewed people who are currently involved with the program, which still is, for example, has a captive breeding element, they still have birds in captivity, and they also still regularly check on the wild birds and then sometimes give them veterinary treatments to help them deal with the lead poisoning that they're still subject to because of policy barriers to actually getting the lead out of the environment. But all in all, I think it's hard to argue that this was not worth it, because I think the chances are pretty good we would have lost the California condor had we not brought them into captivity. And also, these are long-lived birds. And some of them that were brought into captivity were actually then let out again decades later. And if those individual birds hadn't entered the program, most of those individual birds would have died of lead poisoning. So in this case, saving the species also meant saving the individuals from early death. And so the trade-off really was, for this wild animal, is it captivity or death by lead poisoning, which is, I think, an easier argument to make that captivity is the right call there. In other captive breeding programs, it might not be so straightforward. How bad off is the wild population? How much do they hate being in captivity? Are those individuals that are going to get out? How many generations do you have to keep in a box before you let it back out? So the weighing of this, I think, becomes interesting. I mean, for me, this was all very mind-stretching stuff because I had spent decades believing that extinction was the ultimate evil and that you were allowed to basically do anything to prevent extinction. So even kind of thinking about the idea that some interventions might be too much was new for me. Genetic integrity is another kind of similar case where, and many of you may have heard that in the West now, to protect spotted owls, which are famously endangered and have been since all of us can remember, well, maybe all of us, most of us. They have been shooting barred owls because barred owls are coming into some of those same habitats, in some cases just taking those territories, and in some cases actually breeding with the spotted owls and creating sparred owls, which are interestingly fertile. So the concern here is not just that the barred owl will displace the spotted owl, it's that it will pollute its genome and make it less pure. And this is where I don't like those kinds of discourses. They start to make me feel uncomfortable. So I should also disclose that my husband, who is a philosopher named Yasha Rower, and two other philosophers wrote a piece for the New York Times just a couple months ago arguing that this control program of shooting these barred owls was not a good use of taxpayer dollars. I think that reasonable people can definitely disagree about this. I will say that at some level, there's a little bit of utopianism, I think, weirdly, in the project of trying to save the spotted owl. The spotted owl definitely needs old growth habitat. There's hardly any old growth habitat left. That's sort of on us. And to kind of get mad at the barred owl because it does a lot better in kind of second growth or patchy, kind of fragmented habitat, seems like we're kind of displacing the blame for who really is causing the downfall of the spotted owl. You might say that the barred owl is in fact better adapted to the current environment. And interestingly, fun fact, all of the biodiversity and ecosystems that we love were created through evolution and through adaptation to challenging conditions. It's just that we're now the challenging conditions. And so it does seem a little odd that when life adapts to the challenging conditions that we've created, our response is to go in there with a shotgun and try to unadapt it for them because we want it to look like the way it did when Christopher Columbus stepped off the boat. So now I'm going to move on to killing to save species. In this case, these are direct predation threats. So this is a picture of some albatrosses and some little mice on an island called Gough Island in the South Atlantic. And these mice are basically, this is a chick in the foreground. Their chicks are big, and the mice just eat them live, like whole, like vampires. They just eat them. It's really horrifying, and these are rare birds, and in this case, there's a subspecies called the Tristan wandering albatross that almost the entire breeding happens on this one island. So if those mice are not removed, we might very well lose the entire population. So is that okay? Should we remove these mice? Another example is New Zealand. In New Zealand, most of their ecological niches were filled with birds. Because it was an island far away. And so everything had to get there somehow, and so birds would get there, and then they would diversify and fill all those niches. So this is the kakapoa, an incredibly charming, kind of chubby and delightful parrot, flightless parrot, right? So many of them lost their abilities to fly. And this is what a rat will do to a kakapoa egg. So in New Zealand, to save their rare, beloved native species, they have gone all in on removing non-native predators, rats, cats, stoats, and then kind of weirdly Australian possums, which aren't actually carnivores, but they say that they eat food that belongs to other species or mess up the habitat. I'm a little vague on why they don't like the possums. But what's interesting to me and why I went to New Zealand to report on this is that it isn't just wildlife Department of Conservation officials that do this work. It's become the cultural work of the entire New Zealand people. And there's a lot of people who do this in volunteer groups and school groups, and you can sign up to the Predator-Free New Zealand website and get your own rat trap and put it in your backyard. And it's become so culturally valued to be doing this predator eradication work that it started to edge into kind of unpleasant territory in terms of how they're bragging about these kills on Facebook and treating the bodies. These are some Australian possums that were dressed up at a school fundraiser. So it's become, and if you go to Zealandia, which is a kind of a native species only preserve in Wellington, you can actually buy a throw pillow that shows you who's bad and who's good. So the kiwi is good, and then the rat and the stoat and the Australian possum are bad. It's like just amazing to me that you would want that your values would be so important to you that you would actually want them as home decor. So I think that there's, a conversation to be had about whether this culture of conservation killing is ultimately good for the moral fiber of a people. But then again, there's a conversation to be had about whether not doing this killing will end in the extinction of beloved, birds that have been there for a long time. So this brings us to compassionate conservation, which is a relatively new kind of movement of conservationists who are troubled by some of these things. Especially, I think, conservation killing. I think what kind of kicked it off was a kind of a culture of conservation killing as a first resort. I think that on the North American continent, we maybe don't see this as much because a lot of our conservation problems are habitat loss, climate change, development. But on any island smaller than including Australia, non-native predators are usually one of the biggest threats that you're dealing with. And so in Hawaii and New Zealand and Australia, all throughout the Pacific and the Atlantic, there's a whole non-governmental organization called Island Conservation that just kills things on islands. So I think that and the kind of assumption that it was always justified, always okay, is what really kind of kicked off the compassionate conservation conversation. So this is Ariane Wallach, whose name fell off my slide. Her name is Ariane Wallach. And she, in the case of mice on the island, told me that mice aren't our children or our pets or our livestock, and that they have their own agency, and that if we go around killing all the animals that we think are in the wrong place, that we're being chauvinists. But I think, I really respect Ariane a lot, and I spent some time in the field with her in Australia, and we would get into some real talks by the fire about, well, okay, but I kept, after all this time being so concerned with extinction, it was really hard for me to be like, oh, so we're just supposed to let these other animals die, and horribly too? Like, what about their pain? So we got into it. But one thing that I quote from a paper that she wrote with several others that I think really spoke to me is that some of these conflicts may not have a right answer. So they wrote that when you can't find these approaches that manage to protect individual well-being of animals and the collective protection of the whatever species or subspecies or population you care about, then you're going to have to sort of own and take responsibility for the fact that there's not a right answer, and either move is going to result in bad things. I think some people call this moral injury. That when you're in a position where you sort of have to take on, do something bad because you have no good options, you yourself become injured by this. But this is the position we've put ourselves in by the way that we've interacted with the non-human world for generations, at least in many parts of the world. All right. I did want to touch on this question of wild animal suffering. I know this is not a wild animal. But I was out with a wolf biologist right in my backyard in southern Oregon, and we were chasing this wolf around, trying to find it, trying to figure out what it was up to. And I was very focused on the wolf and thinking about the wolf's life and what it wanted, and very empathizing with the wolf. And then we came around a corner into this field, and we saw that the wolf had beaten us there, and this was what it left behind. And suddenly my perspective shifted, and I felt very sorry for this animal's mother, and for the rancher that lost this animal. And of course, it isn't just livestock. Wolves eat all sorts of wild animals as well. And being killed by a wolf is probably the worst animal way to die. Like, if I had to be executed by a large animal, I would 100% go with a cat, because it will just drop out of a tree, and you'll be like, what the? And that will be the last thing ever. But with a wolf, it will find you, you'll see it, it'll see you, and it will then chase you at kind of a loping speed, never getting tired, just always a little bit behind you, until you run so hard and so long that you have no run left and you fall down, and then it will just come up and start eating you. It won't even bother to kill you first. It will just start eating you. And their teeth aren't even that sharp. They're kind of blunt. So one of the ways that they identify that a wolf has killed a livestock animal is by the bruising around the bite marks. So it is a rough way to go. It's interesting, some philosophers are really upset by this suffering and this pain that exists in the wild world. Martha Nussbaum is one of them. This quote is from her 2009 book, because that's what I had available to me when I wrote my book. She's since written another book that's even, I think, more radical. But she kind of thinks that there are some animal interactions that are just too horrible, and someone ought to do something. Like, we shouldn't just let these predators hurt these animals like this. This is, like, not cool. And so she's perfectly happy to see some pretty aggressive interventions into wild systems in order to make them more humane. I found the idea that we're supposed to be, my husband called these guys the pavers. Because if you follow their line of reasoning, ultimately you'd end up just paving the whole earth. Because all ecosystems are food chains. Everything is eating something else. And even plants can have responses to predation. They have chemical and physical and sometimes even audible responses to being eaten. They don't like it. So if you really want to avoid all pain and suffering in the world, you have to avoid all ecosystems. You can't have food chains. They're all built on pain and suffering and death and blood. Like, the whole thing that I have spent my entire adult life trying to protect is nothing but like, a slaughterhouse. A very organized, complex, beautiful slaughterhouse, but that's what it is. So that's tricky, I think, for a lot of people, including me, to get my sort of ethical head around. I did find some help with Val Plumwood, whose name's also fallen off the slide. Val Plumwood was an Australian philosopher who had this amazing experience where she was almost eaten by a saltwater crocodile, which she describes incredibly vividly in one of her papers, probably the most page-turning philosophy paper ever written. And she came out of that experience basically saying, okay, look, if we are so worried about causing harm that we pull out of nature and we try to not have any impact at all, whether that's through veganism or through making protected areas that we're not allowed to enter, or getting really focused on decoupling from natural systems, if we do that, we are alienating ourselves from the food webs in which we are ultimately and inevitably enmeshed. You cannot float above the food web. You cannot escape the planet, unless I guess you literally escape the planet. And even then, you're going to be using resources and material from Earth. We're all part of these ecological relationships. We are ecological beings. And her approach is to basically accept the fact that we are ecological beings, accept that we're in food webs, but accept that on both ends. Accept that we might cause suffering or allow suffering or even eat other animals, in her view. But that we also have to accept that we could be eaten, that we are also energy for the next layer up. And I think, that is something that I'm not there yet, and the project I'm working on now hopefully will get me closer, but this has been helpful for me in trying to square this, what seemed like irreconcilable tension between wanting to do right by individuals and wanting to do right by collectives, which are based on killing individuals. Other cultures, so this is some pictures I took in the Amazon when I went there for National Geographic. Other non-Western cultures often have a much less dualistic view of humans and nature. And I think there's a lot we can learn from these different cultures. In particular, in the Machiganga group that I visited, there was, for example, a belief that some old people turned into jaguars in their old age, and then after death. And this didn't seem particularly remarkable or even supernatural to them. It just seemed like a way in which you could have, it's like one possible aging story is to become a jaguar. They also had a lot of reciprocal relationships with other animals that they would eat, some of which weren't necessarily as lovey-dovey as you might think. A lot of them were about avoiding revenge from the spirits of the prey that they had eaten through various rituals. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's all kumbaya to have a kind of a more enmeshed relationship. There's a lot of negotiation, a lot of tension, but it's a negotiation and a tension and an interplay of a bunch of different animals all in the forest rather than one kind of entity over here and all other entities over here. So After writing the second book, this is now my current list of what I think is valuable in the non-human world. Flourishing of individuals, including autonomy for many individuals. I'm not sure if an oak tree values autonomy itself, but certainly a wolf or an elephant does. And then this second one is flow. It is that what Val Plumlin talked about, the sort of movement of energy and material matter from node to node in the food web. I mean, if you think about it, if you had an ecosystem that you cared about and somebody said, oh, it's going to get bulldozed, but it's okay, we're going to take every single animal and every single plant and we're going to put them all in separate little boxes and we will keep them alive with synthetic foods, you would be like, no, we've lost something. They have to be interacting. It's that flow of stuff and energy between them. It's those relationships that we actually care about and that makes nature, quote unquote, special to us. Biodiversity is a little bit of a cop-out because I'm sorry, after 30 years of caring about biodiversity, I can't stop yet, but talk to me in a few more years. And then the last one is human compassion and humility. If I learned anything from trying to figure out how to solve these problems, it's that we are not smart enough to solve them. We don't have all the tools to solve them. Maybe our descendants will be able to do better than we have or that we're capable of, but I think acknowledging that we're not going to be able to find the right answers in any given lifetime is important. The flow, the movement from it's like it starts to get mystical very quickly, but I do think there is something about these arrows themselves and not just the nodes that they connect that is important to us. And I'll give Val Plumlin the last word, where she talks about how a society that values individual life forms, like we value an individual friend, an individual animal, will experience conflict with the idea of all these flows of the food chain. And in my book, I write about this from the point of view of having kids and feeding my kids and the pleasure I get while I watch them eat, especially when they're little, like when they're babies. If any of you have babies or have had babies, like watching a baby eat is very, very primal. You're like, yes, grow, infatten. But in order to do that, you have everything that's going in that baby's mouth used to be somebody else's baby, you know? That's how it works. So what she sees is that bringing those two narratives together, that she thinks that they can be reconciled with this kind of idea of an ecological order with sharing, generosity, and equality between species. So it's like the flows go both ways. That's what's important to her, is that we're not going to get rid of the flows and the suffering and the pain and the death, but we are going to participate as equals. Whatever that means, that's the tricky part. I did promise I would say what I'm working on next. I don't really have much time. I will say this is an ecosystem diagram of just a tiny field with some spiders in it and the things that the spiders eat. It's incredibly complex. And here's a look at some shipping routes that connect different parts of the world. This is just container ships moving stuff around. My next book is about how these are the same graph, actually, that it's all just one big, gigantic network of flows, and how that kind of breaks your brain, but it can also help you figure out what a better future might look like. So that's it. Thank you so much. Yes.
I was asked to ask you if you could name the book that you liked that discusses animal.
Oh, yes. Okay, I'm going to get the title wrong because it's a phrase. It's not fear of an animal planet. It's fear of the animal planet. It's by Jason Hribal, H-R-I-B-A-L. It's heavily cited in my book, so if you buy my book.
Right there.
Yeah. That's right, I can look it up. All right, you can go with the next question and I'll look it up as we're talking. Here we go. Jason Hribal, Fear of the Animal Planet, The Hidden History of Animal Resistance, 2011.
She says thank you.
Any questions? Questions? Here's one.
So, when you were going through these
Martha, yeah, right.
And so was her perspective limiting conflict with predators and wild animals, or predators and domestic animals, or both?
So the question is, can I talk a little bit more about Martha Nussbaum, who is a philosopher who wants to limit conflict? She wants to limit conflict among wild animals, predator and prey. She talks about ways in which we could create meaningful, happy, rewarding lives for predators without letting them actually eat any living animals. This is a vision that's pretty radical. You know, it means like completely dismantling ecosystems and refashioning them with a lot of human control. And I think that's part of the reason that I don't find them compelling, is that we would have to be the kind of puppet masters of these worlds in order to create these kind of painless worlds. And I think that's pretty hubristic. But I do sympathize. I have a chapter in my book about baboons, who are really, like, female baboons are like constantly being harassed and bitten and hurt by male baboons, and like pisses me off. Don't really like it. So I can understand why people are troubled by suffering in the natural world. Yes.
Okay, so this Ashley is saying that she's read Rambunctious Garden, but not Wild Souls yet. She appreciates your perspective on these complex subjects. As you said, we are challenging the condition. Isn't accepting adaptation as the solution to human-caused biodiversity loss taking the responsibility off people? Do we accept a die-off or hybridization as nature's solution to conditions created by humans? And we are the considerations for indigenous perspectives and connections for species, and how this shows up in our management. Sorry, this is so long.
That's right. Can they hear you reading the question?
Probably not.
All right.
I can copy and paste.
Yeah, copy and paste the question.
And then,
And I'll get going on the first part of it, which is, does accepting a certain amount of natural adaptation sort of abrogate our responsibility towards all of these species that we put in really rough conditions? And I think, yeah, I agree that that's, if we just completely threw our hands up and said, well, we're just going to let the cards fall where they may, we're just going to, like, you know, see what lives and what dies. There are people, I think, who would argue for that. And I think that's a little bit, I do think that we have some responsibility to certain populations that are in trouble. But like one thing that I think is important is that when we're trying to figure out how to help those populations that are in trouble, that we take a beat to see what's happening anyway, and whether what's happening anyway is something we can work with rather than fight against. So in the questioner mentions hybridization as a potential bad outcome, but I actually think that hybridization is often potentially a good outcome when the hybrids are more successful, because then you still have continuation in some sense of both or genetic lineages, but now they're in a package that's able to persist with a lot less hand-holding. And so I think, you know, in cases like, there's some good examples in the freshwater fish world of this, where introduced trout and native trout will hybridize, and people are like, I don't know, that seems kind of crossing the lines, but these hybrids often do quite well. And then it's like, well, would you prefer to have only introduced trout, or would you prefer to have a mix? I think we're afraid of hybridization and kind of edges blurring. But I actually think that that's what, I mean, more and more, I think we're learning that those kinds of mixtures and melanges and horizontal gene transfer are like huge in what created all the biodiversity we love in the first place.
So I agree with you with the hybridization being, more beneficial than not. I had a question on your opinion. You mentioned in the book if, polar bears were to hybridize with grizzly bears, since they're moving more on land, you'd get like a, not a pure white bear, which is what people seem to be concerned about for whatever reason. But the concern that I do see is that conservation efforts, or people's view of them being unique and special, could go away because they're not
unique and special, yeah.
polar bear or whatever. So
All right, so the question is about, the question's about bears hybridizing and whether it's dangerous to, for example, let the polar bear and the grizzly bear hybridize, which is something that has been happening as their ranges kind of bump into each other under climate change, because that would destroy the sort of unique and iconic looking white polar bear that has been able to marshal a lot of conservation concern and resources. It's a very pragmatic question, and I think it's a good one. I also think that the previous question had a second part about indigenous perspectives, which I can sandwich in here a little bit too, which is that I think that there are a lot of far north indigenous communities that have thoughts on this, either that don't care that they're hybridized as long as they are bears around, and others that would like to see the white bear persist in the white bear form. So I don't know, like sometimes I sort of feel like the answer to a lot of these questions is like, how about a 2-year-long multi-stakeholder process where everyone sits around the table for a really long time and talks about all the things they care about? And it's not like a very neat and tidy answer, but I do think it is often going to have to be the way. And hopefully in those multi-stakeholder processes, we have somebody who's like, I'm representing the polar bear, and I'm representing the grizzly bear, and I'm representing the seals. Like, will someone think of the poor seals? Like, if they're the food. So I think I really wanted in writing this book for there to be an algorithm for solving these conflicts that I could fit on a t-shirt. Like, I desperately wanted that, and let me tell you, my agent wanted that, my editor wanted that, the publisher wanted that, many reviewers wanted that, but it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen, because these are, number one, we're not smart enough yet, and number two, these are just such case-by-case questions, and they also require lots of different voices at the table, and not just some expert who's like, well, I've decided, or not just me being like, actually, hybrids are fine now. Like, it has to be a much bigger conversation. As at meetings, the answer is meetings. It's not very satisfying.
Okay. Do we have one more short
question? We have a short one. Okay. We have a few more.
One more short question.
Okay.
Whoa.
I'm going to mute that back up.
Okay.
I'm wondering about your thoughts or information you have about the ethics and efficacy of deer hunting as population control.
I'm not the I do this question. This question is about the ethics and efficacy of deer hunting as a form of population control, and given the composition of my audience and hosts, I dare not opine on this. I think it's a complex question that many stakeholders should be invited to many meetings to discuss. Yeah, I will say that the family I married into are roadkill collectors, and I was wooed by a philosopher who fed me roadkill deer cooked in his mother's French style. And I found that it was an extremely effective courtship method. So that doesn't answer your question at all. But I do think that there's complicated questions about eating, hunting, killing. I have a chapter about hunting in the book.
She does have an addendum.
Oh, what's the addendum?
Specifically, I am part of a trust that is considering opening an archery hunting on some of our land as a means to limit a too large deer population. I'm conflicted personally about the responsibility we have to the ecosystem and the responsibility we have to the individual deer.
Okay. You should talk to me.
Yeah. Yeah, I think.
I've answered that question once or twice. Yeah. In my way.
I think, again, yeah, many reasonable people will differ. I'll just say, if you're gonna shoot deer, make sure you have a clean shot. And with that very folksy piece of advice, I thank you all very much for coming. Happy Valentine's Day, and thanks.
And there are books down here to that.